1 out of every 7 adult laborers in this country is in healthcare. And so what changed for me in the last year, I think, was first the continued exponentiality of the tech, right? It's not a bunch of like predictable, incremental, measurable improvements. It's really just a bunch of non-linearities where we're getting these step function advances in capability.
Today on the show, Steve speaks with Eric Larsen, president of Tower Brooks and a venture partner at Thrive Capital and Signalfire.
Welcome to the Heart of Healthcare podcast.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Heart of Healthcare. I am your co-host, Steve Krause, and today we welcome back Eric Larsen, who is the first 3-time ever guest on the Heart of Healthcare. Eric, welcome.
Awesome, Steve. It's a trifecta. I'm super honored.
We are on a roll, my friend. So our loyal listeners will remember that a little over a year ago, we had Eric on. It was actually our most widely listened to podcast ever, where he talked about one of the first really well-written pieces I saw on how AI is going to affect our healthcare industry. He called it the Gen AI juggernaut. U.S. healthcare is not prepared. Then a month ago, we had Eric back on to look back over the past year that had happened, comparing the predictions he made in the Gen AI juggernaut piece and where he thought those predictions stood. And we got a lot of questions from our listeners. And so we're going to do an Ask Me Anything today with Eric. Eric has a second piece out. It is very lengthy, but very awesome, in which it's titled The Healthcare's Oppenheimer Moment. Eric presents the case in the piece that clinical AI is not an incremental technology upgrade, but a civilizational inflection point, and that it's medicine's equivalent, based on the title, of potentially the atomic bomb moment, where the thing has been built and the only question remaining is whether humanity has the moral seriousness to deploy it responsibly. Pretty hefty subject indeed. So Eric, we're going to talk a bit about your newest piece, but we're also going to ask a bunch of questions that listeners had from our last pod. And so I'll start with that. The first one, it comes from Muhammad Anas. I hope I got his name right. He posted on LinkedIn the following question. The real question now isn't whether healthcare is prepared for AI, as you said, Eric. It's whether the organizations that they thought were preparing are actually just building expensive proof of concepts that nobody will deploy at scale. So we wanted to know, what shifted most for you between the first recording and now? Is it the technology? Is it the buyers? Or is it the will of the industry to actually change their workflows?
Yeah, so that's a really nuanced question and really kind of multidimensional. So I want to kind of deconstruct it. But maybe I'll take a step back, Steve, and give a little justification to my somewhat hyperbolic title, Healthcare's Oppenheimer Moment. And I kind of subtitled it, The Industrialization of Intelligence and the Implications for U.S. Healthcare. And I think readers who kind of glance at the cover page, and I sort of very provocatively, had Los Alamos, and then on top of it is this sort of like disembodied neural network brain. And, what I was trying to do, and this really goes to the question from the listener, is, try to capture that moment where we sort of came to this realization that this was a civilization shaping technology. And the exact Oppenheimer quote, the epigraph that I start the essay with is, this thing appeared in the world with such a shattering reality that we didn't have time for the edges to be worn off. And I just thought that was so resonant. I mean, it deeply resonated with me. And it really goes to the listener's question about what changed in the last year. And, for me, I'm not analogizing this moment to a thermonuclear device. I'm analogizing it to the realization where we just see the magnitude of the implications, the dislocations in the labor market. And you and I, in our past 2 podcasts, talked about, the surface area exposure of healthcare with 23.8 million workers. 1 out of every 7 adult laborers in this country is in healthcare. And so what changed for me in the last year, I think, was first the continued exponentiality of the tech. Right? It's not a bunch of predictable, incremental, measurable improvements. It's really just a bunch of non-linearities where we're getting these step function advances in capability. And so I do think that a lot of the incumbency, and you and I have played with this sort of juxtaposition between the incumbents and the insurgents. I think the incumbency has predominantly been in point proof of concept purgatory. right? And I sort of irreverently in the new piece called it this professionalized hesitation. Where we're just sort of like, we're performatively doing these, these POCs, but very few of them are industrializing. Very few of them are scaling to production.
You're kind of saying that the old way that the incumbents, health systems, payers rolled these things out, crawl, walk, run, point solution testing. Your tone in this piece versus the AI juggernaut, I would note, was a little angrier, a little less patient than it kind of felt like, what the hell are we doing? We got to blow up the model of how we tested these things before and start with a new mind. Is that, am I reading that right?
I mean, I think that's fair. I hope I didn't come across as angry because I do feel agitation. Maybe I'm just involuntarily showing my anxiety.
Okay, great. Anxiety. Sorry, better word.
Yeah, because I just feel like we're seeing this upend vertical after vertical with every successive Claude skill or plugin release. Another vertical sees a few $100 billion of market capitalization incinerated. Healthcare has been insulated because of the regulatory enclosure and, frankly, a lot of the justified societal disquiet of going too fast, right?
Right.
So,
do no harm.
Healthcare is not monolithic. AI is not monolithic. I like to subdivide it. And again, I'm not dogmatic about this particular set of subdivisions, but I think about it as administrative simplification, care augmentation, synthetic and computational biology, and consumer empowerment. Certain things in the front category, that first entry door into healthcare, which is the $1 trillion of largely adversarial payer-provider friction. I am impatient to see that eliminated. My friend Dave.
What ending do you think we are there? Because I actually have seen a bunch of startups of which we've invested, you've been part of, actually scale quicker than any other, what I'll call software startup in healthcare historically. So there has been progress, at least from the venture stage world. I'm like, wow, these Bridge, Smarter DX, Pivotal Health, like these companies, Cuventus, they're scaling really quickly, faster than any other company I've been involved with on the software side.
Even though those companies, which I really have a lot of respect for, they're scaling super fast, but they're scaling off a denominator of zero. Right?
Yeah.
They're scaling off of nothing. And so when you think about the impenetrability of the healthcare sector, in all of its $5.3 trillion like magnificence, right? You're starting to see documentation, summarization, ambient listening, coding. We saw that last year. We've seen that really entrenched. I think that's largely been diffused.
That's good.
But the deflation hasn't happened yet.
Right,
My friend David Brailer just published a really erudite piece in Health Affairs arguing that this first chapter is inflationary. And he's right, because you've got two adjacent models. You've got the extractive application of AI to the old reimbursement system that's moving in parallel with the sort of reconceptualization of the model. If you didn't need this human labor intensity, what can be automated, augmented, or eliminated? Or what capabilities are newly available to us because this intelligence is getting industrialized? So what's changed for me, just to answer the listener's question, is the acceleration of the capabilities and almost the immobilization of the incumbency, right? So that's the juxtaposition, which is the potential is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're just seeing it refracted through the incumbency with more deliberation, more slowness than I'd like.
What I really loved about the healthcare Oppenheimer moment, besides I just love the title. It's so provocatory. But I love the fact that you really went deep in clinical AI because it's an area of real interest. And I agree, the administrative simplification is important, but where this technology is going to have massive impacts on hopefully the quality and lifespan of humans is on the clinical AI side. So let's talk about how one of the anxiety provoking associations that makes you a little angrier in your tone, I'll say, which is the medical guild. I know you have great reverence for it, and you call it the infallibility trap. You write that do no harm can't mean do nothing. And I want a listener had a really great question. It was an anonymous listener, but they asked, all the data show that AI is better at reading radiology reports than radiologists alone. Plus, comparing the millions of reports that are out there to get even a better data moat. You see it in mammograms, lives can be saved, cancer could be found at grade 0. Imagine a world where actually you could find cancer at grade 0, yet adoption is so freaking slow.
Yeah. I think to the sort of like rational observer, you want to start with areas where the risk tolerance is high. You want to start in administrative simplification. And then gradually and very circumspectly, you want to move to clinical AI where the risks are much higher because you're touching human lives. I actually think that like all virtues, in the extreme, it tends to its own vice. And I kind of characterize that as the infallibility trap. We in this country hold technology to a hypocritical standard of perfection and infallibility. We're remarkably tolerant and forgiving of human errors in judgment, errors in effectuation of something. And we built a whole military industrial complex around institutions that confer credentials and ordination so that you can practice in a certain discipline. And then an entire military industrial complex around the malpractice, the product liability, the sort of professionalized, sort of legal proceduralist system that we have. And in the paper, I kind of juxtaposed. Dan Wong wrote this amazing book about China and the US called Breakneck. And he said, China is an engineering society. The US is a lawyerly society. And an engineering society builds. 20 of the 22 Politburo members, including Xi Jinping himself, they're engineers.
That's amazing.
Versus half of Congress and half of all of our presidents are lawyers.
Right.
And there's a monumentalism that comes with an engineering state because you've got sort of state-sponsored capitalism and you want to build. But there's the antithesis in a lawyerly society, which is this sort of land of the eternal no, and this in love with proceduralism. And I think that's really quintessentially the story in medicine. And so if we're holding technology to this absolutely unattainable standard of infallibility, can never be wrong. And if it's wrong, we are going to have like Old Testament like wrath, and we're going to bankrupt the company like we saw with Cruise in an autonomous driving situation. And I think the downside of prudence is we're forfeiting these longevity, and I'm going to stipulate a lot of this is theoretical. But we're potentially forfeiting the greater sensitivity and specificity in diagnostics and radiology and pathology reads. We're forfeiting what Dario talks about is this 10 to 20 year expansion in human longevity, that the returns to intelligence in biology are higher than just about in any other domain, because biology is around high dimensional data, high entropy data. In the paper, I somewhat provocatively said, biology has outrun the biological brain, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Like in 1950, it took 50 years for the sum total of human medical knowledge to double. By some estimates, and some of this is stylized, by 2019, that was 73 days. And then I used Claude and estimated it's now down to about 14 days doubling.
Crazy.
And, what is the human reaction to cognitive overload?
Yeah, I think you freeze. I think you'd probably do nothing. Right?
You freeze. And, I kind of characterized it. There's a chapter in the paper called, Generative Epistemology and the Future of Science. And I kind of categorized it as, look, we have three very rational reactions to an avalanche of data, right? The first is hyper subspecialization. We draw smaller and smaller circles around the body. We look at the body through a straw, and you get this proliferation of medical subspecialties. And so we sort of subdivided our focus on biology into this sort of atomized group. And then to reintegrate the body, we've built a multi-trillion-dollar bureaucracy around it. So the first rational response to cognitive overload is hyper subspecialization. The second is bureaucratization. We build this edifice around it. And then, the third is homogenization. We sort of glom on to the same scientific ideas, the same biomedical ideas. And the listener was asking about radiology and pathology. And Geoffrey Hinton, back in 2016, who's one of the godfathers of AI and a Turing Award winner and a Nobel laureate in 2024 in physics, for his work on sort of originating the concept around neural networks. He very famously said radiology and pathology are going to be obsoleted as professions. And then there's this sort of triumphalism that's happened over the last few years where people are pointing to that prediction and saying, hey, a decade later, see, it still hasn't happened. Jensen Huang, who founded the most valuable company in the history of free markets, NVIDIA, and somebody I have enormous regard for, always talks about the Geoffrey Hinton prediction in 2016 as a sort of example of the hyperventilation of technologists, and this is going to be job creating, not job dislocating. Well, let's look at that. First, I think Hinton was early, right? This was pre-transformer paper in 2017. This was pre some of the major step function jumps in multimodality and the ability to process images and really getting access to the big unstructured and structured repositories of those reads. And, you've just seen these nonlinearities in the text. The tech is infinitely better. But when you have a technological breakthrough and it runs headlong into the guild, right? It's got to be refracted through a few different lenses. It's got to be refracted through the liability lens. We can only move at the speed of blame allocation. And one of the things I argue in the chapter on clinical AI is we've got to disambiguate this crazy quilt of contradictory and overlapping and, just sort of like bewildering, federal, state, municipal, and local regulations. And so you've got to refract that through liability lens. You've got to refract that through the reimbursement lens. If you're incentivized in a fee-for-service environment and you get paid per read, you're going to see a major deceleration if the technology is capable to do the reads much more expeditiously and much more accurately. You've got to get it refracted through the ordination and credentialing societies, which on the one hand are about safetyism very appropriately and the Hippocratic Oath of first do no harm. But on the other hand, I'll juxtapose like Hippocrates with Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair said, it's impossible to get a person to understand the opposite of what his salary tells him to understand. Right? And so when the guilds are understandably cautious, it's hard to disentangle the economic implications here as well. And so, I look at a company like ADOC, which is founded by my buddy Elad Wallach,
Yep.
right? And he built a proprietary foundation model that is superior in a lot of different quantifiable ways in the reads. And what I tried to do in the piece was have a little bit of a provocation. We have to have an open conversation around the diffusion of clinical AI. The status quo is not morally innocent. I have reverence for healthcare in this country, but we still have 371,000 annual deaths due to misdiagnosis or treatment decisions. We have another 440,000 injuries that happen because of misdiagnosis. So the status quo is not morally innocent. And
let me ask a question there, if you don't mind. I think when I interpreted your provocation that do no harm does not mean do nothing, and this relates to a listener's question, is in some ways that's the incumbents using narrative warfare to kind of maintain their incumbency. And so a listener, Kristen Konstantidis, I hope I got that right, said, you cited narrative warfare as one of the three ways incumbents preserve their advantage, but you didn't unpack what winning the war actually looks like. So I want to get practical here. As clinical AI scales and public skepticism remains high, how does the insurgents own the narrative? And what does it take to build the kind of trust that lets this technology actually diffuse, Eric? And I'd add to the question, what specialty area do you think that war is actually going to be won in first? And how is that going to play out in your mind?
No, it's a really thoughtful, nuanced question. And I think in our last podcast, I somewhat mischievously said that monopolists have the same playbook, right? Regulatory enclosure, narrative warfare, and bringing up the drawbridge on interoperability. And we've seen this throughout history. And we're seeing it today. And now it just has a lot more moral valence because we're talking about something sacred. I mean, I think about healthcare as the most intimate sector in the US economy, where you see a convergence of technology and science and the most sacred space of our health. But it becomes very human when a person is experiencing frailty or vulnerability or sickness and reaching out to another human for either amelioration or just some sort of care and some sort of compassion. And so, when you add that dimension, when you add the moral dimension, it gets really fraught really fast. And I don't think it's going to happen from the vendor side. I think it's going to be combated from within the domain of the establishment. And we have to find a way to get the establishment to champion these changes. And again, I'll go back to that Upton Sinclair comment, you can't get somebody to understand the opposite of their salary tells them to understand. So what is the solution from a reimbursement and compensation point of view? I think it's really going to see capitation and full delegation and global payment get its day in the sun.
Yeah.
And right now it's really been a marginalized thing.
AI, you almost argue, is the rebirth of VB's value-based care.
I do, but I want to be really careful and I want to disambiguate something because VBC defined as upside only as a gratuity is nothing.
Yeah.
It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
Right. So I think not you, not me, but I think a lot of us conflate VBC with capitation. I'm going to be really precise in my definition and say there has to be downside risk. There has to be downside to the reimbursement mechanism because I think ultimately a lot of what is going to be automated through AI is going to be a lot of the things that we did in bulk because the fee-for-service reimbursement hydraulic incentivized us to do that. A lot of the adversarial payer-provider dynamic, I think, is going to get automated away because right now you've got sort of warring parties, armed encampments on either side that right now are sort of weaponizing the technology with the old system. But back to the listener's question. I think once we can line up the establishment, and look, this is super reductive. This is an unforgivable oversimplification, but I'm going to go with it anyway. If we can get the clinicians, the preeminent academic medical centers, the payers, some of the life sciences companies, the med tech companies, and CMS, CMMI, and HHS to really hold hands around the fact that, one, we're not going to hold technology to an impossible standard of infallibility. Two, we're going to disambiguate the medical malpractice and the product liability framework in this country. Three, we're going to stop talking about sequencing from administrative AI and then only later in some Edenic perfect future, once we once we sand down all the hard edges, are we then going to go to clinical AI, right? And we need a win.
Yeah.
We need a win.
Yeah.
And
what
I mean
look
by
like?
that, well, I think what it looks like, the biggest win of the last 50 years is AlphaFold, right? I think that's the greatest scientific achievement. We talked about that last time. But we need something more accessible. Yeah. We need a rural hospital doing a diagnosis that previously was only available at the Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic. We need a AI-designed biomolecule or biologic to advance from stage 2 to stage 3 to FDA clearance to commercialization. Right now, we've got one drug in stage 2, and that's an in silico molecule for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, for a lung disease. And I think, once we begin to see a proliferation of these AI designed molecules and biologics that hit the market at 1/20th the cost at 20x the speed. Now, by the way, once we do that, we're going to run headlong into other bottlenecks, right? Like the clinical trials bureaucracy.
I think about the potential of AI on the drug discovery and side. Let's stay there, the early part of the drug development process. And it's amazing. Identification of previously undruggable targets, creation of molecules that never existed that can hit those targets. Like I have it's already happening and it's going to happen at even more warp speed to your point. But then I fast forward, a lot of these companies are raising at $10 billion valuations, much more valuable than most of the public biotech companies that are later stage in the markets. And there's a disconnect for me because all of the cost, all of the time is actually on the development side, running the trials, getting the regulatory approval, right? And so that's where I get hung up. And when you talk about disentangling the clinical trial bureaucracy, like that to me, I don't have a view of how that's going to happen. Maybe you do.
I do think we're going to have the same, sort of entrepreneurial energy applied to that. And, Trial Spark then turned into Formation Bio.
We're having Ben on the podcast in a week or so. Yeah.
Well, I think really highly of Ben, and yeah, I just think they're pioneers here. There's a proliferation of companies that are seeking to bring AI first principles to the clinical trials process. It's something we're looking at TowerBrook as an example, to partner with one of the large health systems in sort of expediting this domain. We're big evangelists that like these administrative and documentation heavy processes are eminently automatable. But there's a big point, and you and I talked about in our last podcast, I sort of somewhat provocatively said software's uninvestable. And
yeah, that stuck with me.
Yeah. And this most recent sort of flashpoint on are the God models better diagnosticians than the specialty LLMs? Yeah, I think this is one of the most important things to happen recently, because I'm a subscriber to the idea of Rich Sutton, who's a Turing Award winner, one of the real luminaries in Silicon Valley. He wrote one of the most consequential essays in all of Silicon Valley history back in 2019 called The Bitter Lesson. And for our healthcare listeners, it's worth a read. Just Google Rich Sutton, The Bitter Lesson. And what he basically said is, look, the bitter lesson is we like to encode our human expertise into our algorithms. Makes us feel good. And in the short term, you get a bump, right? You get a proficiency bump. It's like an expert system notion. But the bitter lesson is that if you just keep throwing compute and you keep throwing just exabytes of data, eventually that sheer just multiplicative force of compute times data yields better outcomes. And it's almost like, why put human superstition into the model? We want models that can discover, like we can, actually more computationally proficiently than we can, not to discover what we've discovered. And so, I thought about the bitter lesson when I read the Nature magazine article that came out on the 15th, just a few days ago. And, obviously Open Evidence is an amazing company, and I'm a huge evangelist for what Daniel Nadler and the team have built, and they partner with New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. But I do think that there is an inexorability of the God models. The God models are generalized. It turns out when you get trained on the sum total of human digitized civilization, you get pretty smart. And going back to our earlier conversation, Steve, about what is our reaction to cognitive overload, it's hyperspecialization. Well, these models, these intelligences do exactly the opposite. They are polymathic. They take all of the disciplines all at once. And so, I do think that in medicine and in healthcare generally, we've got a very limited amount of time where we can build models and workflows and partner with the incumbents to really avail ourselves of the tacit knowledge, of the encoded wisdom, et cetera. We should be doing this in partnership with the God models. Why? Because when you invest trillions of dollars in infrastructure, it's really hard to compete against that kind of like CapEx and that industrial mobilization. And so, we've got to find a way to teach healthcare to the God models, and the God models have to make themselves accessible to us. And we're starting to see some of that, but I do think that healthcare startups, even the richly valued decacorns, have a very limited amount of time to outrun the competencies, the generalized competencies of the God models, and embed themselves into the workflows.
I love the focus on the God models, talking about the paper. I'm sure all listeners will quickly read that paper. By the way, we will also, in the show notes, have a link to Eric's new paper, The Healthcare's Oppenheimer Moment, so our listeners can read that. It's a great read. I want to shift my question around the God models and your admiration for them. I'm amorous too, where we luckily are investors in Anthropic and love that company. But I want to talk about the liability thesis, because I think it's an interesting transition to that. And I love, you've talked about this on the previous podcast, you talked about it now in the paper, you go deep on it. You write, she who assumes the liability wins. And yes. My question here is one where you talk about a lot of companies, but two that you talk about that I think are interesting are Google. And then you also talk about United Health being an incumbent that has, people don't necessarily know that they control roughly 90,000 physicians, 1 in 10 physicians in America, which is, as you call it, one of the most astonishing, underappreciated facts in American healthcare. Combined with the premium funded ambulatory networks, their claims and clinical data, their assets in pharmacy, behavioral health, just the heft of that institution. And then you just talked about the God models. I'm so curious that you chose Google to win. And now Google has their own God model, so maybe that's one of the reasons. But I was interested how you compared Google and United Health, and you went with Google as the one she is going to assume the liability and she is going to win. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I love that you called that out and that you suffered through all 369 pages of the paper.
Well, maybe I used a little help.
with a little help from Claude. I'm getting so much grief from friends who are like, "Why didn't you write a summary?" And I think I didn't write it just to be
because you knew everyone was gonna use Claude to summarize it.
It took me so much damn time to write that paper. You can now that you can feel how aggrieved I am. I kind of used Google as an illustrative example, and I didn't quite juxtapose it that sort of cleanly, but I kind of said, look, you're going to need a fortress balance sheet to assume the medical malpractice, the product liability responsibility for this, given how litigious our society is. But I look at Google, which will be the most valuable company in the world. They're about a $4.6 trillion market capitalization today. I think the combination of Google's past aspirations to serve healthcare and their fortress balance sheet and the $126 billion of free cash flow, although almost all of that is spoken for in TPUs and data center construction and nuclear power grids, et cetera. But I kind of use them as an illustrative example. I do think that whoever assumes the liability is going to win. You have to have enough conviction in your product that whoever knows more should shoulder more responsibility for the liability. And given the complexity of the algorithms and the euphemism, the technical euphemism in San Francisco is called mechanistic interpretability, right? That's a fancy way of saying we don't understand what the models are thinking. We don't understand their neurology. And so if you're building a model, you better have enough conviction in the safety, the specificity, the accuracy of the model to assume the liability.
Got it.
And, my supposition was that ultimately, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Google, whether it's Amazon, one of the hyperscalers with the balance sheet of a sovereign country is going to assume the liability. Now, I went to United as an example. I have enormous respect for United. And I do think having 1 out of every 10 physicians in the country.
Crazy.
And having the premium dollar. Let's go back to my earlier comment. Capitation and clinical AI.
Because you said downside risk is the ultimate risk, but actually liability, to your point, is truly the ultimate risk, right?
Absolutely right. You're encapsulating it spot on the way I think about it, which is the liability and the downside risk. So if United got enough conviction in the diffusion of the tools, especially in clinical AI, and took UHC, took the premium dollar, delegated that to Optum Care and the 100,000 doctors that they have, either through direct employment or through really close alignment that's tantamount to employment, you should see massive reductions in medical loss ratio. You should see synchronization of medical, pharmacologic, behavioral, social determinants of health. Yes, you should debureaucratize what the physicians are doing. I think you're going to see 10x the increase in the panel size for clinicians just through the administrative simplification. But then if you equip those clinicians with the differential diagnostic capability of a God model or a specialty model, and eventually going into the multimodality, going into the behavioral implications, this is going to be the real renaissance of healthcare, where you're lining up the liability question, you're lining up the reimbursement question, you're partnering with the insurgents that are developing a lot of these clinical capabilities, but you're infusing it into the incumbent. United is beautifully positioned to win. And I actually think you're going to see a real renaissance of the vertical integration strategy for payers. You're going to see massive commodification of the underwriting business. That is going to go toward utility compensation, right? So 2 years ago, the net profits on the $1.6 trillion in premium collection went from $69 billion down to about $20 billion. I think that is going to go asymptotically towards zero.
Wow.
I am very short on the long-term prospects for payers that don't embrace this moment. I'm a big evangelist for Oscar Health. I will tell you that I don't have optimism for the payers as actuaries. I think the returns to scale on being a payer are going to diminish. I think you're going to see a resurgence of provider-sponsored health plans. I've been telling health systems, don't sell your health plan. It's about to become a lot cheaper to run your health plan. Look, you're going to have this big Cambrian explosion of possibilities for each of these sectors, for the health systems, the payers, life sciences companies, med tech, and which incumbents move fastest and most decisively. I have a very unpleasant chapter in the paper called CEOs, Find Your Inner Autocrat.
Yep.
Democracy is not going to prevail in this moment, I'm sorry to say, as a idealistic Democrat, idealistic, sort of like a believer in democracy.
Yeah, you tell
I think
you call that
is going to be better.
You tell the healthcare 150 to stop acting like passive procurement departments and start co-developing clinical AI. It was pretty. I hear the call to action. It's really interesting because, like, you think United Health can win. You think maybe some of the Blues can win. You think they can transform their business. But it sounds like if they don't do it, you think the ones who really understand these models, these God models, may surpass them.
I think it's about being bilingual. And, how quickly can you speak AI, and not in a performative way? I mean, I asked the CEOs, like, how much time are you spending with the AI systems every day? Mark Cuban recently came out and said, there's two types of people in the world. And he said, those that are going to use the AI to hyper accelerate their learning, and those that are going to use it to avoid learning at all. Mm-hmm. And I asked the CEOs, like, where are you on that spectrum? And then how vulnerable are you being with your tens of thousands of employees about your own journey, your own odyssey in learning AI? There's something really democratizing about these tools, right? If I use the tools, I become polymathic, I become omnidisciplinary, I become good at a lot of stuff. Ignorance is no longer acceptable with these tools, right? But the productivity accruals come to me as the individual. The productivity is not yet accruing to the enterprise by and large. Part of that is because what is the nature of a firm? Well, the firm is many to one. I want to combine many talents in legal and sales and product and engineering and combine them into one purpose or a few purposes. This technology is one too many. It's contradictory, right? And so the enlightened CEOs, the benevolent autocrat, as I'm calling her in this new regime, figures out how to make it safe for the individuals to play with the tools in a HIPAA-compliant, data sovereignty, non-data exfiltration way, and have some sort of forward-deployed engineering, forward-deployed teacher concept that captures those benefits and diffuses them to the organization. But that doesn't happen if the CEO herself is not all in and benevolently autocratic about diffusion.
Hey, Eric, let's talk about one of the reasons why I feel like these technologies might not feel safe. And you talk about it. We talked about it a little bit on our last podcast, is the labor issue, which is that these technologies are going to replace labor. And we had some listener questioners about this, is sort of what you call this Orwellian conspiracy of silence about job dislocation. And so let me ask a question that one of our listeners asked. It was Jeff L. He said, assuming that AI can and will be used to automate a significant amount of administrative, and I'll add to it clinical work to where your recent paper goes, what new jobs will be created that the people currently working in these roles will be well suited for? And how do you see all this playing out? Because this is 1/7 of American jobs, you said at the beginning, is in our industry.
Yes.
Like, this is not going to be a great thing in the near term for many, many, many people. So how does this all play out?
Look, this, Steve, may be the most important question that you and I addressed today. But I want to spend a minute on this because I have a very contrarian, deeply unpopular take on this. And I'm going to get villainized for the following. I believe this is going to be mostly substitutive of jobs eventually. And this is a raging debate right now. David Sachs has been completely vociferous on the point that, look, he thinks it's all nonsense and safetyism and doomerism, and Anthropic is sort of promulgating this like doomerist narrative to get regulatory capture. Jensen has come out very unambiguously and says this is going to be job generative, et cetera. My own view is that if this is a multiplication of intelligence, you can't extrapolate past technological phase shifts to this one, because every past tech phase shift has destroyed some jobs, but has created many more in counterbalance. You've seen this through every industrial revolution, mechanization, electrification, computerization. And so people are very understandably extrapolating the lessons of history forward. If you believe, as I do, that this is a non-linearity, right, then you can't point to the dot-com era and say, sure, it destroyed 3 million jobs, but it created 19 million jobs in counterbalance. 80% of jobs in the economy didn't exist 60 years ago. In the year 1900, 40% of the economy was dedicated to agriculture. And 50 years later, it was 4% and 90% contraction. And so history is on the side of those that are arguing this isn't going to destroy jobs. And the CEO of Goldman Sachs just came out and wrote an op-ed that says, hey, this is going to be generative of jobs. I get it. And it's a really scary thing to say that this may be dislocating. But again, multiplication of intelligence, it's a cognitive augmentation. We've never seen a technology that is coming for the intelligentsia. All past automations have augmented the earning power and the societal prestige of knowledge workers. We have 23.8 million laborers in healthcare. So my belief is that, and I actually take pains in the essay to really come up with a schematic on how this is going to happen. I believe the domains that start with functional verifiability, where there is math or coding or a functionally provable answer, the models excel at those automations. And right now, you're going to see a really interesting jagged transition, like coding, right? At first, everybody was apocalyptically saying all coding jobs are going to go away. But as David Sachs pointed out in the most recent All In pod, you're actually seeing an increase in the postings. Why? Because when you only partially automate
You're talking about
function,
software coding.
That's right.
Yeah.
You actually democratize it. Now, everybody's a coder, right? And we need more engineers and software experts to do verification on the output. ATMs are a really interesting example. When ATMs first emerged, everybody apocalyptically said it's gonna kill the bank teller job. But what actually happened is it automated some of the basic accounting things, the money counting, et cetera. And it augmented the productivity of the tellers to the point where it actually reduced the cost for launching a bank branch. Instead of just keeping the number of bank branches static, they increased the number of bank branches. But instead of doing low calculations and counting money, the bank tellers did more customer interaction. And so over 20 years, because of only partial automation, you saw the number of bank teller jobs go from 400,000 to 600,000. But when you saw the complete automation of the role, you saw a very precipitous drop over the last few years in the number of bank tellers. I think the ATM example is really applicable because when you only automate part of a workflow, all of the focus goes to the bottlenecks, right? And right now, it's a jagged frontier of intelligence. You're seeing some partial automation, some augmentation, et cetera. I don't think this is going to happen cleanly. And you've got something called the Jevons paradox, which you and I talked about in our last podcast. The cheaper a commodity becomes, including the provision of care, the more people are going to demand it. We have 1.8 million unfilled jobs in healthcare. So I'm not predicting breadlines in healthcare, but I am saying you are going to see a diminishment of administrative heavy, documentation and data heavy functions, things that have functional verifiability. I think you're going to see areas that have codifiability or are rules based, or you can decontextualize the workflow. I think you're going to see a diminishment in human intensity there. Net, if the number of doctors in this country went from 1970 to today and an increase of 150%, and yet over that same time scale, the number of healthcare administrators increased 4,300 plus percent, a lot of the administrative intense jobs will be diminished. Overall, I think this Orwellian conspiracy of silence is just this sort of this refusal to say that if you are multiplying the cognitive substrate, you are going to see labor dislocation. And I just think it's unproductive to just have this sort of denialism. And I find it interesting that the folks on the All In Pod, again, who I really like, are sort of eliding the fact that the guy that they revere and the guy that I revere too, Elon Musk, is saying exactly this.
Yeah.
You're not going to, you're going to enter a radical, abundant, post-scarcity society. Humans are not going to need to work. And so, there's a criticism of Dario. There's a criticism of Jeffrey Hinton. There's a criticism of those that are stepping out and saying, we think there's going to be some job dislocation. And I think we need to have a rational conversation about what workflows get automated and how do we retrain to the bottlenecks.
Well, Eric, I guess that is the Oppenheimer moment. And we will surely have you on a podcast in the future to talk about what we do next. But this was great. Again, I encourage the listeners, we'll post in the show notes, please read the piece, read it fully to make Eric happy. But thank you, my friend. Always enjoy our conversations. Really appreciate you coming on the pod.
Steve, it's an honor. And I look forward to being the first 4-time guest on your excellent pod.